Oral arguments in the case of National Automobile Dealers Association and Texas Automobile Dealers Association versus the Federal Trade Commission just wrapped up in the federal courthouse in New Orleans. Jeff Harris represented the petitioners, NADA and TADA, while Ben Aiken argued on behalf of the respondent, the FTC. A three-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case. Those judges were Patrick Higginbotham, Jerry Smith, and Stephen Higginson. I'll collectively refer to them as the court. And in the interest of full disclosure, I cannot pretend to be a disinterested observer of this case. My company, Mosaic Compliance Services, participated in the litigation by submitting an amicus curiae brief to the court in support of the petitioners. Now, here's what happened. Jeff Harris spoke first on behalf of the petitioners. He addressed the court and responded to their many questions for 25 minutes, leaving 5 of his allotted 30 minutes for rebuttal. Mr. Harris stressed 3 main points. First, the CARS rule should be set aside because the FTC did not follow its own mandatory procedure to enact it. Specifically, the FTC did not issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Second, the FTC's failure to issue an advance notice was not harmless error. And third, the FTC's entire process was arbitrary and capricious. This argument focused on the FTC's suspect cost-benefit analysis and confusing ill-defined terms in the rule, such as offering price and express informed consent. The court frequently interrupted Mr. Harris to question him on both the legal issue of whether or not the advance notice was actually required and the factual issue of whether or not its absence harmed the interest of the petitioners. Let me be clear, the court was not being hostile, just thorough. And the issue of whether or not an advance notice was issued is more than a foot fault. Mr. Harris stressed that part of the reason for an advance notice of proposed rulemaking is to determine if a rule is necessary at all. Skipping that step was therefore a very, very big deal. After 25 minutes, Ben Aiken took the podium on behalf of the FTC. He was well prepared and did a good job with the facts he had to work with. As you can imagine, every point Mr. Harris made, he disputed. He argued that no advance notice was required under the present circumstances. Even if an advance notice was required, the petitioners were not harmed by its absence. And finally, the FTC's rule-making process was not arbitrary and capricious, but well-reasoned and thorough. Like Mr. Harris, Mr. Aiken also had to field constant and probing questions from the court. The court's questions for the FTC largely mirrored those put to the petitioners. I couldn't detect any bias or favoritism to either side. Both were put to the test. I would say that both sides had skilled counsel and both brought their A-game. Neither side had a slam-dunk case. The legal issues, like was this a rulemaking under Section 18A1B, are extremely technical. The factual issues can be judgment calls. That's why we have judges. Jeff Harris returned to the podium to speak last in rebuttal. Even in this wrap-up segment, he continued to respond to questions from the court. One question in particular struck me as significant. With only about 90 seconds to go in the entire proceeding, the court asked Mr. Harris, would one possible outcome be a remand with a stay remaining in place? The answer, of course, was yes. This was clearly stated in the petitioner's reply brief. In other words, it wasn't a question that even needed to be asked. I took this as a signal that the court might go that route. Remand means that the Fifth Circuit would retain jurisdiction over the case and send the rule back to the FTC to address any issues NADA and TADA raised in their original petition for review. This is significant because such a remand would likely push any final resolution of this matter out until after January 20th, 2025, when a new administration could be in the White House and a new composition of the Federal Trade Commission be in place. And while that process plays out, the stay of enforcement of the rule would remain in place. Not a bad result, that. Whatever the FTC brings back to the Fifth Circuit would come with the risk of that court throwing the entire rule out. So there is incentive to reach common ground with the petitioners. I could see an outcome where the FTC gets its regulatory definition of what constitutes a deceptive trade practice and the ability to assess hefty fines for their violation. I could also see an outcome where the FTC abandons its obsession with offering price disclosures, but sticks to its definition and limits the scope of its express informed consent documentation requirement. A workable compromise is possible. Finally, what should dealers do today based on the possible outcomes to the CARS rule litigation? Obviously, if you're doing any of the things the CARS rule defines as a deceptive trade practice, such as payment packing or selling gap-on cash deals, stop doing those things. I would also suggest creating a CARS rule policy, but call it something else like sales practice policy, that mirrors the bad acts the CARS rule calls out and expressly prohibit them. Then, train your sales and F&I staff on the substance of that policy and keep the training records. For Auto Dealer Today, I'm Jim Ganther. Thanks for watching.